We'll quickly go over what we did the last time we met, and then we continue from there to do one or two things which we didn't cover the last time on hormones. So the last time we started to study some fundamentals of endocrinology, and we were looking at the structure and functions of hormones in general, some very basic aspects of hormones. Now we began by looking at what hormones are, and we said there are two major communication systems in the body, and these are the nervous system, which transmits signals by electrochemical impulses through the nerves. And the second communication system is the endocrine system, in which we have organic substances that are secreted by specific tissues we refer to as endocrine glands that secrete these organic substances, which are hormones, responsible for the regulation of metabolic processes in the body. So these hormones are secreted into the circulatory system, secreted into the blood. The blood transports these hormones from their site of secretion to their target cells, where they interact with some specific targets, which are also some biomolecules. It could be proteins, it could be some lipids. And by their interaction with these receptors, there is an ultimate biochemical response. And in general, we saw these hormones being secreted from the brain. So we have the pineal gland, which secretes some hormone. We have the pituitary gland, which is right below the hypothalamus, which is also a gland responsible for secreting some pituitary hormones. The hypothalamus, of course, we'll see also secreting some hormones. Then we also saw the thyroid and the parathyroid hormones, which are secreted by the thyroid and the parathyroid glands around the neck. And we talked of the adrenal glands, which are at the anterior position of the kidneys. Then the pancreas, also one of the glands for the secretion of the digestive hormones, insulin. We have the ovaries and the testes as the glands for the secretion of sex hormones responsible for secondary sexual characteristics. We went ahead and looked at the classification of hormones, and we saw two different forms of classification of hormones. The first was based on the chemical nature or the chemical characteristics of the hormones. And by that, we saw the hormones categorized into three different groups. The first is the peptide hormones, and the second, the steroid hormones, and the third is the amino acid derivatives. And we saw that the peptide hormones were those that have at least two amino acids bonded together and should not be confused with amino acid derivatives. Amino acid derivatives will be an amino acid that is having some extra side chain attached onto it, or it's also is bonded to some organic molecule. It could be even carbohydrates, it could be a lipid, and that will be an amino acid derivative, just a singular amino acid that has some other group attached to it, will be a derivative of an amino acid. But a peptide will consist of two or more amino acids in it. And the steroid hormones we saw to be derivatives of cholesterol, and these were lipophilic by their nature. So these were the three different groups of hormones we saw based on the chemical nature or the chemical characteristics of these hormones. Then we went on and looked at the second form of classification, which was based on the mechanism of action of these hormones. The first was what we refer to as the group 1 hormones, which are those that interact with intracellular receptors. And they interact with intracellular receptors because these hormones are lipophilic, and thus they could penetrate the plasma membrane into the cytosol and also penetrate the nuclear membrane into the nucleus, where they could interact with the nucleic acid material, the DNA, in the nucleus, activating specific genes and thus their expression. Then we have the group 2 hormones, which do not penetrate the plasma membrane. They only interact with receptors on the surface of the cell. So these receptors are also biomolecules that are embedded in the plasma membrane. And these hormones interact with them just at the surface of the cell and do not penetrate into the cell. And generally, we saw further that, yes, the group 1 hormones, which are lipophilic, are actually steroid hormones because they were derivatives of cholesterol, which was lipophilic and thus could penetrate into the cell, whilst the group 2 hormones were the peptide and the amino acid derivatives, and which did not penetrate the plasma membrane but could interact with the receptors on the surface of the cell. We went further and saw subcategories or subclasses of the group 2 hormones, and we saw 3 different subclasses which were based on the second messengers that the group 2 hormones use to transmit their signals. As you see that the second, these group 2 hormones do not penetrate the cell into the cytoplasm and into the through the nuclear membrane into the nucleus, and thus will have to transmit through some other molecules, which we refer to as second messengers. And by that, we have the classification of the group 2 hormones by the second messengers into 3 different groups. The first one was those that had a second messenger, being the cyclic adenosine monophosphate. And the second group was those that had phosphatidylinositol together with calcium as their second messenger. And then the third group were those that did not have any known second messenger, even though they are known to be group 2 hormones and thus did not penetrate into the cell. They only interact with receptors on the surface of the cell. There is not any certain second messenger that is known to aid in the transmission of their signals. Then we actually saw specifically the mechanism of action of the group 1 hormones, which were steroid hormones that could penetrate into the cell, that the hormone could penetrate the plasma membrane into the cytosol and bind with a receptor, which is also a biomolecule, which could be a protein or a lipid or some other biomolecule, could be some glycoprotein. And this results in the formation of a hormone receptor complex, which then penetrates the nuclear membrane into the nucleus. And that the hormone receptor complex then interacts with a regulatory portion of a specific gene that the hormone is responsible for activating, that region being referred to as the hormone responsive element, and thus activating the expression of that specific gene. That is activating the process of transcription of messenger RNA from the gene, and then the process of translation, which is the synthesis of a specific protein, which then will give an ultimate biochemical response, depending on the protein which is synthesized. Either the protein is an enzyme and thus will be acting in the catalysis of a biochemical reaction, or the protein is a neurotransmitter and thus will be acting in the transmission of some neural signal. Right. Then we went ahead and also look at the mechanism of action of group 2 hormones, the first subclass, which were those that use the cyclic adenosine monophosphate as the second messenger. Here we saw the hormone interacting with the receptor, which is embedded in the plasma membrane. And this receptor is bound onto a regulatory protein, which is forming a complex with guanosine triphosphate. And that complex of the hormone receptor complex actually activates an enzyme which is also embedded in the plasma membrane, that is the adenylate cyclase, which is responsible for the synthesis of cyclic adenosine monophosphate from ATP by the hydrolysis of a pyrophosphate, that is 2 phosphates, a diphosphate out of ATP to give you the cyclic adenosine monophosphate, which then binds with the regulatory portion of an enzyme, and that regulatory portion then dissociates from the catalytic portion of the enzyme. So you see the regulatory portion that is bound with the cyclic adenosine monophosphate, and you find the catalytic portion of the enzyme now free to act in the phosphorylation of a specific protein. So this could be an enzyme, and its phosphorylation results in its activation. So the phosphorylation of this protein now forms a phosphoprotein, and that phosphoprotein is an active form of this protein, which now gives an ultimate biochemical response. If this phosphoprotein is a phosphorylated enzyme, meaning it's an activated enzyme. If it is a neurotransmitter, for instance, that will be an activated form of that neurotransmitter, giving you an ultimate biochemical response. And once the ultimate biochemical response is attained, the protein, the phosphoprotein, can get converted back to its inactive form also by the process of hydrolysis of the phosphate group away from the phosphoprotein. In this reaction that is catalyzed by a phosphatase. Now we saw that happening, that is with cyclic adenosine monophosphate. And we went ahead and looked at another example, specific example of the breakdown of triacylglycerol into glycerol and fatty acids. So call it the catabolism of fats and oils that we refer to, the metabolism of fats and oils. This is the breakdown of triacylglycerol, which is the storage form of fats and oils or lipids. And that happens in 3 steps, where you have triacylglycerol losing one free fatty acid. One free fatty acid is dissociated from the glycerol backbone, and then you'll be left with a diacylglycerol. A second free fatty acid is dissociated from that diacylglycerol, giving you a monoacylglycerol. And then you have the last fatty acid, which is getting hydrolyzed from the monoacylglycerol. And thus we are left with the glycerol backbone and 1 fatty acid, 2 fatty acids, and 3 fatty acids. So in total, you have 3 fatty acids and 1 glycerol from that process of the breakdown of triacylglycerol, the process which is referred to as lipolysis. Now we see that the very first reaction in which you have the first free fatty acid being dissociated from triacylglycerol, which is the initiation of that process of lipolysis, is being catalyzed by a hormone-sensitive enzyme, which is the triacylglycerol lipase. And that enzyme, if it is not acting, is in its inactive form. And in its inactive form, converted to the active form, that process of conversion is a phosphorylation reaction, where you have a phosphate group from ATP phosphorylating the inactive enzyme, making it active. And in that process, you have the enzyme protein kinase acting as the enzyme responsible for the transfer of the phosphate group from ATP onto the inactive enzyme, making it active. And I mentioned that in biochemistry, anytime you are reading any biochemistry text and you see any protein or any enzyme with the name ending kinase, quickly you should know that the function of that enzyme is to transfer a phosphate group from one molecule to the other. And that process of phosphorylation you meet often in biochemistry, and that is a form of activation of biomolecules to go into some specific reactions. And after the activation of the enzyme, you will also see the reverse of the reaction occurring, where you have dephosphorylation. So you have a dephosphorylation of the active form of the enzyme. And that will now give you back the initial inactive form. And that in that process, you have the enzyme phosphatase, which is responsible for the hydrolysis of the phosphate group from the protein. Then we saw further where the action of hormones come in, and where also we see the second messenger, cyclic adenosine monophosphate, also coming in. So we see that cyclic adenosine monophosphate is an activator of the enzyme protein kinase. And this cyclic adenosine monophosphate is produced from ATP. And again, in that process, you have adenylate cyclase. We saw this happening earlier when we saw the earlier diagram where the hormone was interacting with the receptor in the cell membrane. So ATP, from which you have the cyclic adenosine monophosphate being produced, by the release of a pyrophosphate. That is, two phosphate groups are given out and you are left with a monophosphate. And you have adenylyl cyclase making sure that that adenosine monophosphate forms a cyclic form of the monophosphate. Now, in that process, then that is where you have these enzymes activating the production of the cyclic adenosine monophosphate, norepinephrine, epinephrine, glucagon, tyrosine, glucocorticoids, etc., etc. You can have other hormones and other hormones such as insulin acting as an inhibitor of that process. Even after you have the synthesis of cyclic adenosine monophosphate, you can have insulin activating the process of the breakdown of the cyclic adenosine monophosphate into just its linear form, and thus deactivating it. In other words, insulin actually blocks this formation of cyclic adenosine monophosphate, which will be resulting in the breakdown of lipids. Caffeine, on the other hand, does the opposite of insulin, where it rather blocks the formation of the linear form of the monophosphate, thus promoting the synthesis of the cyclic adenosine monophosphate and thus promoting the breakdown of lipids. Then we saw the action of the other second messenger, which was phosphatidylinositol together with calcium. We saw that phosphatidylinositol gets phosphorylated. Again, this phosphorylation reaction is occurring in the plasma membrane, where you have phosphatidylinositol being converted into a phosphatidylinositol biphosphate. And you have another hormone-sensitive phospholipase in the plasma membrane, which then hydrolyzes these biphosphates into two molecules. The first is inositol triphosphate, and that quickly should tell you that even in this reaction of the breakdown into two different molecules, you have ATP also acting, even though it is not shown, meaning there's one more phosphate group that gets attached. There is a phosphorylation reaction happening here, so that from a biphosphate, you now have a triphosphate, and you have now a diacid glycerol. And these two molecules are activators of biochemical reactions further down biochemical reaction chain, where you have the diacid glycerol activating protein kinase, which is responsible for the phosphorylation of enzymes and thus their regulation to give an ultimate biochemical response. The triphosphate will cause the release of calcium ions, which will be acting as cofactors to the protein kinase that is being activated, or it can act as also an activator of some other enzymes. And thus you can have this cascade of reactions occurring where you have calcium ions acting as second messengers to these hormones that are acting right from the breakdown of the phosphatidylinositol biphosphate, or you have the calcium ions acting as cofactors to the enzymes that are acting downward in the reaction. Then from there, we went ahead and started to look at the hormones right from the top, the hypothalamus in the brain. And then right below the hypothalamus, we had the pituitary gland, which is also releasing some hormones. And the pituitary gland we saw was divided into two, the anterior pituitary on the right and the posterior pituitary. And this is divided by the intermediate lobe. In actual fact, the intermediate lobe is considered as part of the anterior pituitary. So you have the anterior pituitary, part of it being the intermediate lobe, and then you have the hypothalamus, which is above. So you can consider these as some form of, you have a story building where on the last floor, you have the brain, and in the brain, that is that specific portion, the hypothalamus, releasing some hormones, and these hormones are coordinating the action of the other glands below it. So the hypothalamus will release some hormones, and those hormones are going to act on the glands that are below it, which is the pituitary gland, so you have the hypothalamus, actually, what the hormones which are released from there acting on the anterior pituitary, as you will soon see that the hormones of the hypothalamus do not act on the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary acts on its own autonomously, is not being regulated by the hypothalamus. It is the anterior pituitary which is being regulated by the hormones of the hypothalamus. And then the anterior pituitary receiving that signal from the hypothalamus, releasing some specific hormones, which will also further down act on the other glands that are below it to also release the hormones to regulate specific reactions that they are meant to regulate. So from there, we started to see the specific hormones. So we saw the hypothalamic hormones. Remember, I said the hypothalamus, you consider it as being on the last floor, and it is that master coordinator of the endocrine system, releasing these hormones that are acting on the anterior pituitary, and the anterior pituitary also acting downwards. So the thyrotropin releasing hormone, for instance, is what will be stimulating the anterior pituitary to release thyrotropin, or thyroid stimulating hormone. And we saw that this thyrotropin releasing hormone was made up of a pyroglutamate, meaning a bi or a diglutamate, which means these are two peptides, two amino acids together. So that's a dipeptide plus histidine plus proline, all of these coming together, giving you a tetrapeptide. Then we also saw the corticotropin releasing hormone, also stimulating the anterior pituitary. This is also a polypeptide made up of 41 amino acids, and these will be acting on the adrenal cortex to release adrenocorticosteroids. You have the gonadotropin releasing hormone, which is a decapeptide, meaning it's made up of 10 amino acids in that peptide chain, which will be stimulating also the anterior pituitary. So you see, all of these are stimulating the anterior pituitary to release specific hormones. So you have these stimulating the anterior pituitary to release luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. These two are responsible for secondary sexual characteristics in both males and females. Now, we saw the last three of the hypothalamic hormones, being the growth hormone releasing hormone, which is also a polypeptide made up of 44 amino acids, and that will also be acting on the anterior pituitary to release growth hormones, or which is also known as the somatotropin. As the name suggests, the growth hormone which will be released further will be promoting growth, as we'll see further down the line. Then we can have the opposite of that, where you have growth hormone release inhibiting hormone. So this hormone is actually regulating the release of the growth hormone so that it keeps it in check. You don't have an excess of the growth hormone being released. So you have the inhibitor also being released by the same anterior pituitary, and that is an oligopeptide made up of 14 amino acids. You have the prolactin release inhibiting hormone, again, that is acting on the anterior pituitary to release you have this that is inhibiting the release of prolactin from the anterior pituitary. Prolactin, which is generally primarily responsible for the initiation of lactation in females after childbirth. He is also responsible for some secondary sexual characteristics in females as well. Then from there, we move on. We are now moving on to the hormones of the anterior pituitary. So we didn't get to this. We didn't do this the last time. Everything we did the last time ended with the hormones of the hypothalamus. Now we are moving down one step to the anterior pituitary, upon which the hormones of the hypothalamus are acting. And we see the classification of the pituitary hormones into three. So the first class is the growth hormone prolactin group, which means you have that being growth hormone and prolactin grouped as one. And we have glycoprotein hormones, and we have the pro-opiomelanocortin family. So what we'll do is we'll take these classes of hormones one after the other and look at some basic characteristics and their functions. So we move on to the first one, which is the growth hormone prolactin group. Now, growth hormone, as the name suggests, will be promoting growth in general. And the production of growth hormone is influenced by epigenetic factors. So you remember when we were studying nucleic acids and the regulation of their functions, we talked about the epigenetic factors which can also act in the regulation of these genes. Similarly, you have the production of growth hormone being influenced by these epigenetic factors, most especially sleep, apart from conditions of stress or even in some pain, physical activity, food intake, type of food that a person consumes. All of these influence the production of growth hormone. Of course, for food is understood. A child that is malnourished will have some stunted growth. One that is well nourished is going to have a pretty good growth. And it is known that the production of growth hormone is in its maximum state. The maximum rate of the production of growth hormone occurs during sleep. And so you find that sleep is very important, especially for the growth of children. So children that do not have good sleep, that if it is persistent, that can actually affect their growth pattern. It can affect their normal growth. That is why you have a very common saying in biochemistry that if you don't sleep, you won't grow, because it is actually during sleep that you have the growth hormone being released in maximum quantities into the blood. Of course, it is during sleep that you have rejuvenation of the cells, including brain cells. So sleep is actually good for growth as much as for relaxation, for rejuvenation of your energy for the next day. So that is important to take note of. Right. Then we see that the action of growth hormone generally is to do with the regulation of metabolism. So that is protein metabolism, carbohydrate metabolism, lipid metabolism, mineral metabolism. You find growth hormone acting in all these processes. So we see this is growth hormone being released by the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary releases growth hormone, and that growth hormone is acting on the adipose tissue, on the adipocytes, where you can have the process of lipolysis. Remember, that is the breakdown of the triacylglycerols that are stored in these adipocytes, the cells of the adipose tissue. So you have growth hormone regulating that metabolism of lipids, either lipolysis, that is the breakdown of the triacylglycerol, or lipogenesis, that is the synthesis of the triacylglycerol from glycerol and fatty acids. So it's acting in both ways, either in the process of catabolism, the breakdown, or the process of synthesis, that is anabolism, of these fatty acids and glycerol to be stored in the adipose tissue. It also will be acting in the synthesis of pigments. Sometimes you have growth hormone acting in pigmentation. That is why you see browning also being there, because you have the synthesis of say the skin pigment, for instance, can be occurring with the participation of cholesterol, the participation of these growth hormones in the synthesis of the pigments of the skin, for instance. So you have this as browning. Then you can also have growth hormone also acting in the process of gluconeogenesis, which is the opposite of what insulin does. So insulin will rather be regulating the levels of glucose in the body, whilst you have growth hormone rather causing the synthesis of glucose from smaller molecules, which is referred to as gluconeogenesis, to be stored in the liver. So you have that happening, that process of gluconeogenesis happening in the liver. So this gluconeogenesis will be causing the increase of glucose in the blood. Then we also see that generally growth hormone, this is where you see the name growth. So we have growth hormone acting generally in the promotion of cell growth of the muscles, or even in bone, the growth of bone cells, which will be resulting into bone elongation. And that, of course, will be resulting into increase in bone length, bone mass, increase in height, increase in the general growth of the person. And in all of these, you have the insulin-like growth factor acting. So as an intermediary in all these reactions, you'll find this insulin-like growth factor all over, acting as intermediary in these processes of metabolism. So that is generally for growth hormone, which is acting in different metabolic reactions responsible for the general growth of an organism. We saw we see some abnormalities which can be observed with either deficiency in the release of growth hormones or the excessive production of growth hormone in the body. And with deficiency, you have what is referred to as dwarfism, where you have you have organisms that are having smaller bodies than normal. So in human beings where you have dwarfism, you have either you have the limbs, that is the legs and the hands, that are so small, so short than normal. In some instances, you have dwarfism occurring very proportionately over the whole body, where you see that the body size is proportional to the size of the legs and the hands. But in some cases where you have dwarfism not really being caused by hormone deficiency, but could be by genetic inheritance, when in some instances you have inheritance of recessive genes from both parents, which are carriers, and a person picks up these recessive genes from both parents. Sometimes you may see that you don't have that dwarfism occurring in proportionate manner, so that you have a person having smaller hands and smaller legs, but the body is bigger, or sometimes the head is bigger. And such persons suffer a lot from things like ear infection, eye infections, nose infections. Then you can also have the opposite of that occurring, which is the excessive production of growth hormone. Now, generally, a person, we grow from childhood all the way into adolescence, as teenagers, up to about the age of 12, 13, thereabout. Generally, the growth slows down, and but humans will be growing generally all the way to even into our 40s. Of course, there is not that line where you say that at this point everybody stops growing. No, this is individual. You have this is different for different people. People grow all the way into their 30s, 40s, even though when you reach those ages of 30, 40, the growth is not all that significant. It's very small that may be occurring. But generally, I mean, if you have growth hormone, which is secreted in excessive amounts as a child, all the way into about, say, 12, 13 years thereabout, that could be causing gigantism. So I don't know, recently, was it last year or so, or some last 2 years, we saw this man, I think he's from somewhere in Alerebo, who was just growing so tall excessively, and you can relate that to gigantism, excessive release of growth hormone in the body. So you're having excessive elongation of the bones. Now, if it so happens that the person is already has already grown significantly, it's already in his old ages, like say in his 40s, for instance, where growth is not going to be significant again, and you still have excessive, it is after that you are having excessive production of growth hormone in the body. That will result in what is referred to as acromegaly. Now, acromegaly will not result into increase in height, but rather what will happen is because the significant growth process has ended in the person, what you will see is that the extreme ends of the person's body, that is the hands, the palm, the head, and the feet, those portions are where you will see some magnification of those parts of the body. So the hands, that is the palm, will be getting bigger and bigger, or you have the feet getting bigger and bigger, or you can have the head. So the head, because the person has already undergone the significant growth already. So what will happen is, yes, the person's head is getting bigger, but you see really what happens is that there is protrusion of the chin, for instance, the chin protruded, so the cheeks will be getting protruded, and you have that kind of a broad face, occurring. So you see such extreme ends of the body, the palm, the face, the hand, and then the feet, getting magnified, getting bigger, but not the rest of the body. That is what we refer to as acromegaly. Right. Now, so we move on to prolactin. Remember, we were looking at 3 different groups, and the first group was the growth hormone prolactin group. Remember, the first group here was growth hormone prolactin group. So now we take prolactin, and then after prolactin, we go on to glycoprotein, then we go to pro-opiomelanocortin family. Now, prolactin is generally responsible for the initiation and maintenance of lactation. Of course, that will be after childbirth, where you have these hormone acting to cause the stimulation of the production of lactose in the mammary glands. So you have, yes, the sugar which is in the milk, which is coming from the mammary glands, the synthesis of that, and the general process of lactation, the production of breast milk for a newborn baby. You have prolactin acting in that process. Of course, it's even before childbirth, you have prolactin promoting the growth of a particular portion of the ovaries, which is the corpus luteum, which its stimulation will be causing the production of progesterone, one of the hormones which is responsible for the maintenance of pregnancy, and also for the menstrual cycle. So you have prolactin being referred to as a lactogenic hormone, a luteotropic hormone, because as you see, the corpus luteum is one of those that prolactin promotes its growth, and it's can also be referred to as a mammotropin, or again luteotropin, just like it's the same as a luteotropic hormone. A mammotropin because it is acting on the mammary glands to stimulate the production of lactose, and in general, the stimulation of the production of breast milk, which we referred to earlier as the initiation and maintenance of lactation. Yes, somehow it also increases levels of enzymes that are responsible in the metabolism of carbohydrates and lipids. as well. Right, so that is prolactin, even from the name, lactin, prolactin, promoting lactation. You will be able to remember that the major function of prolactin is to promote lactation. So that is the production of breast milk, the stimulation of mammary glands to produce lactose. So you can remember that. Right. So now we move on to the glycoprotein hormones. And as the name suggests, glycoprotein means that these are proteins that are in complex with some carbohydrates. Now, remember that we are still looking at hormones that are secreted by the anterior pituitary. We finished looking at hormones which were released by the hypothalamus, and we moved on to hormones which are released by the anterior pituitary. But I need you to pay attention to the fact that this last hormone here, the human chorionic gonadotropin, HCG, this hormone is not secreted by the anterior pituitary. It is actually secreted by the placenta, but it is being considered here because it has similar biochemical structure with the other glycoprotein hormones which are secreted by the anterior pituitary. So keep that in mind, that HCG is not secreted by the anterior pituitary. Rather, it is secreted by the placenta. It is only being considered because it is also a glycoprotein having similar structure. And here we see that all of these glycoproteins are dimers of alpha and beta proteins. Now, we see that the very first three, as I mentioned earlier, that these three are produced by the anterior pituitary, specifically by the cells, the pituitary basophils, produce the thyroid stimulating hormone, the follicle stimulating hormone, the luteinizing hormone. But the last is produced by the placenta. And because you have the follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and the human chorionic gonadotropin, all of these acting in the sexual reproductive system, we have them being referred to as gonadotropins, these three. These, of course, from the name thyroid stimulating hormone, clearly tells you that it will be acting on the thyroid gland and not in the sexual reproductive system. So let's look at these one after the other. We'll first look at the thyroid stimulating hormone. We move on and look at the follicle stimulating hormone. Then we look at the luteinizing hormone, and then we move on to the human chorionic gonadotropin. So the first, the thyroid stimulating hormone, that is responsible for the uptake of iodine. And generally we know that the uptake of iodine acts in various metabolic processes, and iodine actually cannot occur in an inactive form. So you have an inactive form of iodine, which is being represented here as I negative. And the hormone, the thyroid stimulating hormone, actually promotes the conversion of this inactive iodide into the active form of iodine, which will then act in the process of the breakdown of the proteins, thyroglobulin, which will then result in the production of these two forms of thyroid hormones, the triiodothyronine, which is depicted here by T3, and then you also have T4, which is thyroxine. These two are the thyroid hormones, which are being formed from the protein thyroglobulin. And so the breakdown of it, which is referred to as proteolysis, the breakdown of these thyroglobulin is being promoted by iodine, and that's responsible for the synthesis of these two thyroid hormones, triiodothyronine and thyroxine. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, iodine is responsible for various metabolic processes. And as you see here, this is acting in increased synthesis of proteins. And clearly, that should tell you that it will be acting in the process of gene expression. Again, in that synthesis of nucleic acids, phospholipids in the thyroid gland. Now take note, the process of the conversion of inactive iodine to active iodine is what is referred to as organification. So that you can take note of. If you hear that term, organification, what it means is the conversion of inactive iodine into the active iodine. Of course, you know that the deficiency of thyroid hormones causes generally what's referred to as the enlargement of the thyroid glands, which is called goiter. And as you can see that if you have this hormone stimulating increase of synthesis of proteins, nucleic acids, that is acting in metabolism, then of course you can have deficiency of these, also resulting into stunted growth as well. All right. Then we have the follicle stimulating hormone. So remember the last three of the hormones. If we go back, these last three of the hormones, the follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and the human chorionic gonadotropin are all gonadotropins, meaning they are all acting in the sexual reproductive system. So we are now going to see that these are all acting in the sexual reproductive system. So the first, the follicle stimulating hormone in females stimulates follicle growth and enhances the production of female sex hormones, estrogen, responsible for the secondary sexual characteristics in females, in the development of females. In males, you have that stimulating the production of the male sex hormone, testosterone, which is required for the process of the synthesis of the spermatozoa, which is spermatogenesis, and also for the growth of the seminiferous tubules. It is actually in these seminiferous tubules that you have that process of spermatogenesis occurring. So the follicle stimulating hormone is responsible for the sexual secondary characteristics of both males and females. Then luteinizing hormone. Again, you see that luteinizing hormone in female stimulates the production of progesterone. And we saw earlier the corpus luteum. I mentioned the corpus luteum is part of the ovaries. So the ovary, so this is the ovary and an enlargement of it in order for you to see clearly the corpus luteum in the ovaries. And it is from this corpus luteum that you have the production of progesterone, one of the hormones responsible for the maintenance of pregnancy. We have in males the luteinizing hormone, stimulating the production of the male sex hormone, testosterone, and from specific cells of the testis, which is Leydig cells. So this is a cross-section of the testis, and you have some specific cells which are Leydig cells from which you have the production of testosterone. And these cells are stimulated by the luteinizing hormone to produce the hormone testosterone. Right. Then the human chorionic gonadotropin in females is seen to rise in the first trimester of pregnancy. That tells you it plays a vital role in the maintenance of pregnancy right after the implantation of the fertilized ovum in the womb. You have increase in amount of the HCG, the human chorionic gonadotropin. And thus, conveniently, the test for levels of HCG is used for the confirmation of pregnancy. In a pregnancy test, conveniently, the level of HCG is used in the very first trimester. So in the first 13 weeks, you have this hormone in very high amounts. But after that, it drops low all the way to the very last trimester. You see the rest of the hormones, the female hormones, estrogen, progesterone, and the human placenta lactogen, for instance. All of these, you have them in normal levels after the first trimester. Right. Now, the pro-opio-melanocortin peptide family. So here we see that different hormones are being produced from one gene. So you remember, like if you have a gene from which you are having different peptides being produced, you refer to that gene as polycistronic. If you've forgotten, go back and look at when we were looking at gene regulation, looking at gene regulation, both in prokaryotes and in eukaryotes. We mentioned the fact that you can have a gene which is responsible for the production of different peptides, and these are polycistronic genes. So we see that here, so you see they are numbered from the first nucleotide to the 39th, or you say the first genetic code to the 39, which will be giving you 1 to the 39th amino acid that will be produced from that gene, will be responsible for the adrenal corticotropic hormone, and the 42nd to the 134th, that will be giving us the lipotropin. So these are different hormones that are being produced. This is the 1 to 13th will give us melanocyte stimulating hormone, and 18 to 39th will be giving us corticotropin-like intermediate low peptide. This is another lipotropin. This is gamma. This is beta. Then we have some beta endorphins, gamma endorphins, alpha endorphins. We have enkephalins. Now, the endorphins and the enkephalins are natural analgesics. So you have these that we'll see further their action as natural analgesics. We'll talk about that further. So you see these genes are responsible for the production of different hormones which are grouped as the pro-opiomelanocortin peptide family, because the hormones that are produced from here are referred to, they are referred to as prohormones. From them, you have the production of the specific hormones that are responsible for some specific actions. And you have some of these hormones which are produced from this gene reacting or interacting with opioid receptors. Of course, the endorphins and the enkephalins will be those that will be acting on the opioid receptors as natural analgesics. The melano will be responsible for the melanocyte stimulating hormone. That, of course, means that they will be acting in pigmentation, for instance, so the synthesis of the pigments in the skin, for instance. And then the cortin is responsible for the adrenocorticotropic hormone. That is why you have the name being pro-opiomelanocortin peptide family. Right. So the adrenocorticotropic hormones will be promoting the conversion of cholesterol to pregnenolone in the adrenal cortex. And you have that enhancing the synthesis of RNA. Again, so what it means is that this hormone is acting in the process of gene expression, and thus will be acting in promoting growth. So you have that promotion of adrenocortical growth. Also increasing the metabolism of lipids. So you see there is increase in lipolysis by activating the enzymes that are responsible for the breakdown of the storage form of lipids, the triacylglycerol, in adipose tissue. So you have that adrenocorticotropic hormones acting. So you saw in the mechanism earlier where we saw the breakdown of triacylglycerol into 3 fatty acids and the glycerol, you see that ACTH is one of those hormones that is acting in the production of cyclic adenosine monophosphate from ATP. So from there, you see that specifically, you see the function being written as activating the lipase that is responsible for the breakdown of lipids, and also in the protein synthesis, as well as in the conversion of, so you can say in the synthesis. So in actual part, what it means is that adrenocorticotropic hormone is actually promoting the production of further hormone. This is a precursor. Pregnenolone is a precursor of the adrenocorticotropic hormone from cholesterol. So that, of course, would tell you that that hormone is a steroid hormone from the adrenal cortex. Now, an overproduction of these will be causing hyperpigmentation. So we saw earlier that when we were talking about growth hormone, we saw that there could be the action of growth hormone in pigmentation because we have the synthesis of skin pigments. Melanin actually can be occurring from cholesterol. And as you can see, there is that promotion of a conversion of cholesterol here. So apart from the fact that there is conversion of cholesterol to pregnenolone, you can also have the melanogenesis, production of pigments. And so an overproduction, excessive production of the ACTH can result into hyperpigmentation. Now you see that both in RNA and as well as proteins, you have large amounts of nitrogen. And thus, if you are having this hormone, which is enhancing RNA and the protein synthesis, for instance, it means that an overproduction of it can cause some imbalance in nitrogen in the body. So nitrogen imbalance can be occurring. There can be some impaired glucose tolerance due to overproduction of this hormone. Hypertension, edema, that is some retention of water or muscle atrophy, loss of muscle, loss of weight, things like that can be occurring due to because if you are having increase in lipolysis, that means that you are having a breakdown of the triacylglycerols, which are storage forms in the adipose tissue. If you are having an increase of this, then you can be having that muscle atrophy, loss of weight occurring due to overproduction of these hormones. Now, the next, lipotropin. Also, you see lipotropin is also promoting lipolysis. And then it can also, in the same manner, increase mobilization of fatty acids. Of course, if you are having a breakdown of the triacylglycerol, you would have been forming more fatty acids in the system. So once you have more fatty acids being broken out of the triacylglycerol, you'll be having more free fatty acids. And thus you have increase in these free fatty acids. And as I said earlier, you have this serving as a precursor for the formation of the beta endorphins and enkephalins, which are natural analgesics. Natural analgesics because they have anti-inflammatory activity. So they act in the brain, blocking the perception of pain in the brain. So you actually have these enkephalins and endorphins being increased in high amounts in physical activity. Someone who is involved in exercise can have these enkephalins being increased in the blood to block the perception of pain. So the person does not feel so much of pain at the time that is involved in this activity. You can have this being increased in some other forms of activity. Let's say during times of stress, for instance, you can have enkephalins and endorphins being increased. Just to, it's a form of a natural, bringing about a natural balance of the person. You have this increased in high amounts I was reading sometime some research paper that stated that endorphins and enkephalins are increased in high amounts in orgasm, for instance. So that could actually bring down stress levels, things like that. So you can have endorphins and enkephalins acting as natural analgesics. Now, then we move on to the melanocyte stimulating hormone, and right from the word melanocyte. So quickly is to do with melanogenesis. That is the synthesis of the skin pigment, melanin. It is these cells, the stimulation of it, which promotes the synthesis of the pigment melanin. Though you have this hormone, melanocyte stimulating hormone, acting prominently in lower animals, it is not seen acting that very prominently in humans. You have in humans the process of melanin synthesis occurring all right, but it's not really proven that this hormone actually acts that prominently in that process. Right. Now we move on to the posterior pituitary. So we saw earlier that the hypothalamic hormones acted, or they act on the anterior pituitary, but not on the posterior pituitary. So the posterior pituitary is acting autonomously, not under the action of the hypothalamus. And there are two hormones that are being secreted. Two hormones being secreted from the posterior pituitary. And these hormones are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, just two of them. And as you see, they are also peptide hormones. And these two, oxytocin is also, generally responsible for the initiation of labor, childbirth. So you see, is responsible for vaginal and uterine distension. And it's also responsible for the ejection of milk from the breast for the newborn. It will inhibit the synthesis of steroids and also the stimulation of the nipple. Of course, the stimulation of the nipple is responsible also to give a signal for the ejection of breast milk for the newborn. You have the antidiuretic hormone, which is responsible for water balance. That is by the retention of water from the kidney, so that you don't have a lot of water that is taken into the body being excreted. So there is that balance of water retention. So in some cases, antidiuretic hormone is also being called vasopressin. So kind of it actually causes that kind of a constriction of the filter, the glomerula of the kidneys, so that it controls the amount of water which is being excreted from the body in urine. Now you see that in persons with diabetes insipidus, where they have frequent urination, you have this hormone that is being produced in inadequate amounts. And that defect is what will result in the condition of diabetes insipidus or polyuria. That is release or excretion of large amounts of water into urine. Of course, this condition is managed with some synthetic antidiuretics that, when they are taken, they can cause the balance of that water retention to reduce the excretion of water in large amounts. So that brings us to the summary of what we have been talking about so far with hormones. So we saw that the hypothalamus serves as that master coordinator of the endocrine system, and it produces these releasing hormones, and all these releasing hormones act on the anterior pituitary, and the anterior pituitary secretes these hormones, and these hormones act on these specific glands, and these glands then secrete the hormones that have the ultimate biochemical response in their target tissues. So that I have the thyroid glands and the adrenocorticosteroids acting on liver, muscle, the heart. You have the luteinizing hormone the follicle stimulating hormone, their action on the ovaries, causing the production of estrogen, progestins from the ovaries, androgens from the testes, and these are acting on the reproductive organs. You have the growth hormone, which is acting on the bone for bone elongation, of course, also on the muscle for general growth. Then prolactin on the mammary gland, responsible for the promotion of lactation and the synthesis of lactose. The posterior pituitary, we saw that it was acting autonomous of the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus does not have any coordination over the posterior pituitary, and the posterior pituitary produces two hormones, the antidiuretic hormone, which is responsible for water reabsorption, for water balance in the kidneys. And then you have oxytocin, which is responsible for uterine contraction in childbirth. And all of these, the hypothalamic hormones, the anterior pituitary hormones, their production are being regulated by a feedback mechanism. So a high production of these hormones will give a signal, a feedback signal to these glands, the anterior pituitary. So acting on it as an inhibitor to regulate it. So the system itself is self-regulating, giving it a signal that there is enough of us. So you should stop giving signals for more of us to be produced. The hypothalamus is also under such feedback mechanism. So the regulation of this whole endocrine system is by this feedback mechanism. So that brings us to the end of today's lesson, our second lesson on hormones. The next time we meet, we will look at the very last part of these, the hormones. Remember, we have not looked at some of the hormones in the brain, like the pineal gland, for instance. We have not seen the hormones from there. So the next time we meet, we look at that very last portion of our lesson on hormones. So we'll end our lesson here, and I will take your questions, your contributions now, and then we can go and have a good night. All right, so if you want to say anything, you can unmute yourself. You can raise your hands, I'll call your name, and then you unmute yourself, and then you speak. Yes, Williams, Amoyeboa.
Yeah, so my question is on the growth hormone.
The growth hormone, yeah.
Yeah. You explained that when the growth hormone is not controlled, overproduction of the growth hormone causes gigantism. Now,
yes.
I was trying to find out about the growth inhibiting hormones. At that point, what is it not working?
Okay, so yes, you have the growth inhibiting hormone, which is also being produced. So what it means is that if you have excessive production of the growth hormone, it will mean that its rate of production is higher than the production of the growth inhibiting hormone. That is how come you are having excess of it. So that is a hormonal imbalance. You can say that.
Oh, okay, it's clear.
All right. Any other contribution, questions? Yes. Everybody's tired. You want to go and sleep? Okay, so if nobody wants to say anything, then I will leave you and then I'll go and sleep. Do we agree to that?
Yes, sir.
Who is iPhone?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
iPhone is laughing. All right, so Francis, do you want to say something? Okay, you unmuted and you muted.
No, sir.
Okay, all right. So if nobody is ready to say anything, then I will say good night and have a sound sleep.
Okay, sir. Good night.
All right, good night.
Francis, go and sleep.
So remember that growth hormone is released in high quantity when you are sleeping so that you have a good sleep.
Okay, you sleep and have our growth hormones work.
All right. So good night and bye-bye till we meet again.
Okay, sir. Thanks a lot.
All right.